accountability, and debt has increased by 1 penny. And this is why I have always expressed it in the explicit terms that I have as so much as periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt. So he goes on, he says, so this remains as spendable money in the account of the bank. The decision then is made to have the bank's force wax, and you're going to work for this. As long as you perform labor for the bank each month, the same dollars go into the bank as interest, then out the revolving door as your wages, and then back into the bank as loan payment. Okay, we all understand that. We all know that, okay, well, so, the bank just publishes evidence of our promissory notes together. So when we buy a house, they want 4 houses in interest for it. So we could build 4 houses for the bank in paying just the interest, plus a house to the bank, who's issued our evidence of our promissory obligation to the real creditor, and deny the real creditor interest. And that'll make everything right. Oh, sure, we can all work for the banks. We all have production that the banks can consume and do consume, which is equal to all the interest we are paying on this artificial escalation of debt. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if that were the case, debt would never increase. You see? So this is just a childish example of trying to explain something away by a single case which absolutely positively cannot be reflected across the entire economy, the lie of economy, because the banks can't possibly consume our production uniformly. Every penny of interest we pay is consumed by is paid back to us by consumption of our production. So long as any interest above principal has to be borrowed back into circulation to maintain a circulation, that's how much the debt increases in that period of time over the previous sum of debt. Simple as that. That's all there is to it. Worse, evidently, because of this article, which is the only article I've ever seen denouncing this idea of an explanation of G. Edward Griffin and William B. Ryan, since this time in 2008, G. Edward Griffin has changed his tune. Now he's advocating eradication of interest, and I wonder whose explanation for why he might have borrowed. So we take this point by point. Where does the money come from to pay interest? Griffin carefully reparaphrases the real question to fit his answer and to avoid addressing the practical extent to which his obfuscation must occur to accomplish its purported result. And so, all the care he takes to avoid the relevant issues instead poses the question of whether all this prejudicial and such transparent design is a mere gross mistake. Griffin pretends to introduce a question as if it were never answered by other work existing long before his. Certainly, no one else was projecting from the early 1970s that we would suffer economic failure as a consequence of multiplication of debt by interest, and so I will answer for my own work in particular, which of course is the probable root source of the matter Mr. Griffin hopes to invalidate, however misexplained or modified by ever more imitators. From its beginning 40 years ago, my work and my initial inquisition into the subject matter realized that some multiplication of debt by interest may or may not be nullified by processes such as bankruptcy and consumption of our production by the so-called financial institutions. My work furthermore recognized that an ultimate terminal state might or might not be forestalled by growth, inflation of the circulation, etc. Careful accounting for the potential interactions of these processes, of course, then was a reason to write the models I furnished the Reagan administration, which indeed account for bankruptcy and other processes which reduce the multiplication of debt marginally, except in later stages where gross bankruptcy may become critical. So not only was Mr. Griffin's obfuscation accounted for long ago, the degrees or limitations to which his obfuscation might manifest have been carefully examined clear across literally thousands of entire potential lifespans of systems subject to interest. That is, my models calculated the potential lifespans of thousands of different scenarios. Okay? Mr. Griffin's impertinent story has already been accounted for. Over its whole duration, my work, therefore, has been so careful as to express the quantity by which debt is increased by terms such as, quote, so much as, unquote, periodic interest on the sum of debt. So the real question is not Mr. Griffin's, but how much of the resultant periodic interest on debt will not increase the sum of debt, not just as in Mr. Griffin's example, but by further undesirable processes such as bankruptcy, which Mr. Griffin curiously does not even mention as a further obvious manifestation of multiplication of debt in proportion to means. Mr. Griffin's example, therefore, can only hold sway if we refrain from scrutinizing it at all, because it no more proves that all interest can be or is restored to the circulation without multiplying debt any more so than drinking a thimble of water and walking 10 feet into the desert proved the whole desert can be crossed on a thimble of water. To his second point, which I'll cite first, it would seem, therefore, he says, there is no way that you and all others with similar loans can possibly pay off your indebtedness. The amount of money put into circulation just isn't enough to cover the total debt, including interest. What kind of expert could this guy be that countries might even think of consulting him to solve their problems? You know, I respond to this. I say Mr. Griffin's purported invalidation itself attests to the fact it does not just seem that interest paid out of the general circulation must be restored by other processes to avoid multiplication of debt by interest and dedication of more of the circulation to servicing debt versus sustaining commerce. In other words, Mr. Griffin's one case demonstrates that in the case, and thus in every such case, to avoid multiplication of debt by reborrowing interest, as would increase the sum of debt, so much as periodic interest on debt, every cent paid toward interest obligations must be earned back by the subjects of the system. Every cent. This one case does not answer for how this can possibly occur across the whole system. You can understand why he's totally changed his tune. And who did he pay credit to? His one case did not answer for how this can possibly occur. He went into competition with mathematically perfected economy instead, along with Nassara and Dove of Oneness. His one case does not answer for how this can possibly occur across the whole system. It merely answers for one $80 week case. In other words, for Mr. Griffin's attempted invalidation to hold water, he must answer for how it is possible across the entire system for every cent paid toward interest to be earned back from the banks to which the interest is paid. A single, unaccounted cent of interest, therefore, on the contrary, invalidates Mr. Griffin's obfuscation because it increases the sum of debt in proportion to the circulation. Obviously, a continuous, perpetual such process, then, would continue to multiply the sum of debt in proportion to the circulation. And further still, if there are in fact trillions of dollars of annual interest which Mr. Griffin's obfuscation does not account for, then obviously debt is multiplied in proportion to the circulation to the very substantial and terminal degrees which Mr. Griffin simply denies by gross error. His third point, he says, this has led some to the conclusion that it is necessary for you to borrow the $900 for the interest, and that in turn leads to still more interest. The assumption is that the more we borrow, the more we have to borrow. My response, it is not merely an assumption that it is necessary to reborrow what we pay against interest obligations to maintain a circulation. It is a fact. It is necessary to reborrow what we do reborrow, and what thus does increase debt in proportion to the circulation, because it is impossible across the whole system to work for the bank to the required degree that would nullify multiplication of debt in the form of Mr. Griffin's obfuscation. 4. His fourth point is a phrase. It says, and that debt based on fiat money is a never-ending spiral leading inexorably to more and more debt. My response, obviously, the process has nothing whatever to do with what material the money is made of. What kind of expertise is this? It is simply further obfuscation, hoping to leave the reader with the unqualified idea that a magic material might insulate money from the interest attached to it. Yet, of course, a debt represented by units of any material, subject to interest, would multiply debt in proportion to the circulated units to the very degree that it is necessary to reborrow interest paid out of the general circulation. His fifth point, but it is a fallacy that the only way to pay it back is to borrow still more. That's right, he says, but it is a fallacy that the only way to pay it back is to borrow still more. Well, of course, it's a fallacy that the only way, but unless we can all wax the floors of the banks, to the degree of all the interest that we're paying on this artificial indebtedness, which doesn't even exist to a bank, then it's a fallacy to think the opposite, that we can possibly do this by implementing this one case everywhere. Much worse, it doesn't even justify it. Why are we doing that for the bank who just publishes the evidence of our promissory obligations together? So this is just stupid. Nonetheless, I respond to it. I never said, and my arguments never required saying, the only way to pay it back is to borrow still more. But the only way to pay all the eventual principal exceeding the circulation and interest back is to reborrow whatever is not perpetually reintroduced by the so-called financial system, consuming so much of our own production as you have not accounted for, Mr. Griffin. And the sixth point to which I respond, the assumption fails to take into account the exchange value of labor. And there he goes using those fancy Austrian terms, which mean absolutely nothing. That's nothing but senseless drivel. He doesn't even relate the expression to his erroneous example. So my response is, no, Mr. Griffin, your assumption fails to take into account how incredibly much of our production the banks must consume directly from us to nullify multiplication of debt by interest. And lo and behold, since May of 2008, this man has changed his tune and is competing with a solution that preceded him for 40 years to splinter us further. And now people that I'm talking to in Iceland, again, I heard from the other day, are saying, oh, we have to weigh all these other solutions. All these other things are solutions. Like where? Where is another solution? And why have we had all these rise up in the wake of all this? But for dove of oneness and Edward G. Griffin to scam some money out of us as if they're the authors of solution, when in fact they're very